I was aware that I wasn't white.
The teacher said, no, Tessa's something else. And everybody's eyes are on me and I'm a really shy person. She said, well, what are you, Tessa?
A lot of people imagine that there is some biological tangibility to race because we use it so much.
Welcome to a topic that affects us all, consciously or unconsciously, the concept of race. For centuries, people have divided themselves based on this word, letting it shape societies, influence interactions, and even determine rights. But what if I told you that the concept of race as we know it is largely a myth, constructed over time by misunderstandings, biases, and deliberate misinformation? This episode will dive into the origins of racial ideas, the science behind human diversity, and the truths that many don't want you to know. Join us as we unveil the myth of race and explore how it impacts us even today. Chapter 1: The Origins of Race as a Social Construct. The idea of race as a category for human beings didn't always exist. If we look back into history, ancient societies didn't classify people by race in the way we do now. They recognized cultural differences, languages, and religions. But race as a rigid framework didn't come until much later. In fact, the earliest notions of race emerged in the 17th century, when European explorers started colonizing vast parts of the world. As these explorers encountered diverse groups of people with different physical characteristics and cultural practices, they began to classify humans based on appearance, using terms like Negroid, Caucasoid, and Mongoloid. It was during this period that physical differences became a justification for inequality and dominance. This way of thinking was spread widely, embedding itself deeply into social systems worldwide. The concept of race became a way to rationalize slavery, colonialism, and the domination of some groups over others. It wasn't based on objective science or fact, but on a need to justify exploitation. In many ways, the race-based hierarchies served economic interests, as European powers expanded their reach across continents. But this was just the beginning. The myth of race evolved and solidified over time, entering scientific circles and eventually becoming common sense across societies. Chapter 2: Debunking the Biological Myth of Race. One of the most powerful tools to dismantle the myth of race comes from modern science, particularly genetics. Despite the visual differences in skin color, hair type, and facial features, humans are incredibly similar on a genetic level. Genetic studies show that there's more genetic diversity within so-called racial groups than between them. Take, for instance, two individuals from Africa. They may be more genetically different from each other than a person from Africa is from a person in Europe. This means that using physical features to group people into races is not just scientifically inaccurate, it's completely arbitrary. Further studies also reveal that skin color variations are primarily adaptations to environmental factors. Populations that live closer to the equator have darker skin to protect against intense sun exposure, while those farther from the equator tend to have lighter skin, allowing them to absorb more vitamin D. These differences have little to do with defining races and everything to do with adaptation to local environments over thousands of years. Even the Human Genome Project, one of the most extensive studies of human genetics, found no gene that can determine a person's race. When scientists mapped the human genome, they found that all humans share 99.9% of the same DNA. The remaining 0.1% accounts for individual differences, but it doesn't justify dividing humans into distinct races. The science is clear: race is not a biological reality. It's a social construct, one that was created and reinforced by societal norms rather than scientific fact. Chapter 3: How Racial Categories Shape Society. Even though race isn't biologically real, the effects of racial categories on society are very real. Racial classifications have dictated laws, policies, and social interactions for centuries. Think about the racial segregation laws in the United States, apartheid in South Africa, and caste systems in different parts of the world. These systems were all built on the idea that race somehow determines a person's worth, rights, and potential. In many societies, racial categories still affect people's lives profoundly. From healthcare disparities to economic inequality, race-based classifications have left a lasting impact. Take healthcare, for example. Studies show that Black individuals in the United States often receive lower quality care and have higher mortality rates than their white counterparts. Indigenous populations around the world face poorer health outcomes, often due to systemic neglect and poverty. These outcomes are not the result of biological differences, but rather the lingering consequences of systems that were built on racial hierarchy. And the problem extends beyond healthcare. In the criminal justice system, educational institutions, and even in the workplace, the racial divide continues to shape people's opportunities, treatment, and lives. Chapter 4. Exposing the colorblind myth. Now, some might argue that society would be better off if we just ignored race altogether. This is known as the colorblind approach, where people claim not to see race, assuming this will lead to a more equal society. But the truth is, pretending not to see race doesn't erase the social and economic inequalities that racial classifications have created. Ignoring race is akin to ignoring history. When we dismiss racial categories without addressing the impacts they've had on people's lives, we miss the bigger picture. Racial inequality didn't happen overnight. It's a result of decades, even centuries, of discrimination, exclusion, and exploitation. To create a fairer society, we can't simply ignore race. We have to address the systemic issues that have kept these disparities alive. True racial justice means acknowledging the harm done by these social constructs and actively working to dismantle discriminatory practices and policies. It's not enough to say, "I don't see color." We need to see it, understand its impact, and then take steps to address the inequalities that persist. Chapter 5. The role of media and culture in perpetuating the myth. Media and popular culture have played significant roles in shaping how we think about race. Hollywood movies, TV shows, and advertisements have often reinforced stereotypes and biases, creating a feedback loop that ingrains these ideas in the public's mind. The portrayal of certain races in specific roles or with certain characteristics has reinforced a narrative that isn't based on fact, but on stereotype. Even news outlets can perpetuate racial myths. Consider how crime is reported, with a tendency to overemphasize crimes committed by certain racial groups. This selective representation shapes public perception, often leading to biased views about people of different backgrounds. This is particularly dangerous because media is one of the primary sources through which people learn about others outside of their immediate social circles. To move past these stereotypes, media and culture need to reflect a more nuanced view of humanity. Instead of boxing people into categories, we should focus on shared human experiences and diverse individual stories. Breaking free from these narratives is essential to dismantling the myth of race and fostering a more inclusive society. Chapter 6. Redefining identity and unity beyond race. If race is a myth, then how should we define our identities? For many, race has become a core part of who they are, but we can embrace a more holistic view of identity, one that recognizes culture, history, language, and individual experiences rather than arbitrary racial categories. Embracing cultural identities rather than racial labels allows for a richer understanding of who we are. We can celebrate differences in culture, heritage, and traditions without relying on divisive labels. It's about valuing each individual's uniqueness while recognizing our shared humanity. Understanding that race is a social construct doesn't mean ignoring differences. It means seeing beyond superficial labels to understand the deeper aspects of identity that unite us all. When we redefine identity, we create the foundation for a society that values every person, not because of their race, but because of their humanity. Chapter 7. A vision for the future. Imagine a world where race no longer dictates how people are treated, where identity is about heritage, culture, and personal experience, rather than arbitrary classifications. This isn't just a utopian dream. It's a vision that we can work toward by questioning the assumptions around race and breaking down the systems built on racial hierarchies. The journey to a world without race-based discrimination starts with awareness. Understanding the origins and fallacies of race allows us to move beyond it. By educating ourselves and others, we can begin to dismantle the structures that keep these myths alive. Conclusion: the myth unmasked. In closing, the idea of race as a biological determinant is a powerful myth, one that has shaped societies, fueled discrimination, and created divisions. But science and history reveal a different truth. Race is a social construct, a tool that has been used to control and categorize people for centuries. Today, we have the opportunity to see beyond this myth and to understand that our common humanity outweighs any superficial differences. By exposing the myth of race, we reclaim the power to redefine how we see each other and how we build our societies. The truth is out there, and it's up to each of us to use it to create a more just, compassionate, and inclusive world. Let's move forward together, recognizing that beneath the surface, we are all members of one human family, diverse, unique, and equal. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Let's continue to question, learn, and evolve toward a future. Please like and subscribe to our channel for more content.